At this stage, we've discussed all the basic things one needs to notate time in music notation. But there's one more big step that's left to cover, and that is grouping. Now, if we have a look at this example on here, it looks a little bit like a mess. It's very difficult to see exactly where everything fits in. So our job in grouping is to try and make sense of this, to make it look a little bit easier on the eye. So in a way, this is very much like spelling, in that it's all about making things easy to read. The rules that there are, and there's a whole bunch of rules that comes with grouping, but the rules aren't hard and fast rules. They're kind of general principles. So that's one way of looking at grouping, that as if it's like spelling. Now, before we begin solving a problem like this, we just have to recall the 2 or 3 things that I mentioned in the earlier videos about how we treat time in musical notation. So the one thing I mentioned was the whole thing about the line, and about how we just give some unit of value to that line. So that's the first principle we have to bear in mind. The second principle we have to bear in mind is the whole notion of beats. That what we're actually counting in beats is not lengths of time, but we're counting numbers of beats. And the third thing is bars, which is just a way of just grouping the beats into some order. And so it's these 3 things that we just have to bear in mind and come back to again and again as we're doing grouping. So it's the time itself, the beats, and the bars. So, bearing that in mind, we can start solving a problem like this one. So the first thing we do when we face with a problem like this is we just have a look at the time signature. Now in this case we have the C over here, and so we just have to recall that this C means 4/4. So in other words, there's 4 crotchet beats in each bar. So we can now go and just on top, we can just group everything according to these crotchets. So there's one crotchet, there's another crotchet, and now this third crotchet here is there, and then the dot plus that last quaver over there makes the last crotchet. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 crotchets. So now we can have a look at the time, and now we can have a look at the beats, I'm sorry. So if we have a look at this first beat over here, it's 2 quavers tied together. Now, when we're doing an exercise like this, we're going to treat this little thing as a time. We'll learn about slurs later on in the next set of videos, but for now, this is just a time. Now, there's no reason to tie these 2 together. This is 1 crotchet length of time. So all that we're doing when we split it out like this and tie it over is we're just making it more difficult to read. It serves no other function in music. So we want to make that simpler. So we can simplify that just as a crotchet. Then we've got another crotchet here, and that's fine. That's 1 crotchet fitting into 1 beat. No problems. So we can keep that as it is. Then we have a dotted crotchet, which again is fine. There's no problem with the dotted crotchet then. But this is tied over again to a quaver. So just as for this first one, there's no reason to tie those 2 together. It all adds up. A crotchet plus a quaver adds up to a minimum. And so we can write it that way. We don't write it out the more complicated way. So there we go. So that's the first bar solved. And already hopefully that looks a lot neater and easier to see what's going on there. So we have bum, bum, ba. And what might be helpful as you're doing these exercises is just to mark the beats on top. So bum, bum, ba. Okay, so now we can carry on to the next bar. Now, in this bar, we've got a whole bunch of quavers. And so the main issue that we're going to have is with these, with the flags, with the beaming. So let's start out by just writing that number of quavers just loose. Because when we have a look at the example over there, the major problem with that is that it's already beamed in a certain way. And so when you're trying to solve it, it's confusing to try and work with the existing beaming. So if we do it like that, we can just have a blank slate in a way. And then we have a crotchet over there, and a quaver to end. So again, we have 4 crotchets in each bar. So we have 1 crotchet, so these two belong together. And in fact, let me not be confusing, I'll just do a little dotted line there. These two belong together, and then this one is separate, because these two together make 1 crotchet, and these two together make 1 crotchet. So that's 1 crotchet, that's fine. Here we go now for the second half of this bar. We have a quaver, a crotchet, and a quaver. So if we had to do this in groups, our second crotchet would start there. Now the principle here is syncopation. Syncopation. Which basically means that you shift the beat from where it should be. So, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about understanding precisely what syncopation means, but when we're writing notes, we can have notes that cross over beats like that, and that's perfectly fine for the syncopation over there. Now, what's just important to notice here is that if this wasn't a crotchet note, but was instead, let's say this was, instead of that it was a crotchet rest, then we couldn't write a rest like that. We'd have to change that to be 2 quaver rests. So hopefully one can see the principle that's going on here, that we have crotchet, 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 crotchet. If we group those together, it becomes difficult to see where the beat is. But because when we have notes, we want to have the syncopation, it's a specific rhythmic effect. It sounds a certain way. And so that's fine to write it that way. So if we have this bar, we have bum, 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 bum. So that's just where that beat sits there. Bum, 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 bum. And that's the syncopation effect. Okay, so that's that bar solved. Now we can move on to the next bar down here. Now, if we have a look at this bar, there is immediately a problem that crops up. We got a crotchet, that's fine. It's our first beat. And here we have the syncopation thing again. We have a crotchet and a crotchet that's over the middle of the bar. Now this is one of the rules about grouping in 4/4. Usually in 4/4 time you want to be able to see the middle of the bar nice and clearly there. But again, because this is syncopation, this is not a problem. If it was a rest, if that was instead of a minim note, it was a minim rest, we wouldn't be allowed to write it like that. We would have to split that up into 2 crotchets over there. But fortunately, it's not a rest, it's a note. And so we can keep that there. Now that's fine. That's no problem because we got 1 beat, 1 beat, 1 beat. But now we got a problem here. Because we have this note that's longer than the bar. Because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You shouldn't have 5 beats in the bar. But if you have a look ahead, you can see this bar here is 1, 2, 3 beats. So obviously this bar has stolen 1 beat from here. And you can see I made a little space there just to indicate that. So that's obviously where the problem comes in. So we're going to have to do something to have this note a little bit more clear so that we don't have this blank space at the start of the bar. So now what we can do is we can do the opposite from what we've done over here. We can split the note into 2. So we have that. And so that fixes that problem. We can see the beats there. Then, so there's our first beat over there, which is now taken over there. And there's our second beat in this bar, which is fine, it's 1 crotchet. And then this one is again exactly like that, just other way around. We have a note that's split up into 2 for no good reason. So we can just write that like so. And so this is a correctly grouped exercise. So now whereas here you would have a look at the rhythm and it would be very difficult to figure out what the rhythm is supposed to be. Oops, one thing, we haven't fixed this one over here, have we? So we have 1 crotchet, but it's supposed to be 2 quavers. And here we're supposed to have 2 quavers as well. So now we have beat, 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 beat. But to make it simpler to see, again, I mentioned earlier on that we have this middle of the bar thing. We want to be able to see where the middle of the bar is, because remember 4/4 time goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want to be able to see that beat over there. So that's why we can group these 4 together, but we won't carry this on to go over there, because then we have 1, 2, that's a bit difficult to read. So to make it clear, we do it like that. So again, the rules all make sense, but it's a bit difficult to give a list of rules. I myself have given lists of rules, and in the book that goes with this series of videos, there is a list of rules, but no list of rules for grouping will ever be perfectly complete. So you've got to use your intuition to some extent as well, and that's the easiest way to learn to do this, just to do it by how it looks and how it feels. So if we have a look at this exercise, then it goes bum 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 bum, and that's it. A correctly grouped 4/4 exercise. Next, we're going to move on to a 6/8 example.